Knights are typically known as these valiant heroes who save damsels in distress and live a very honorable life. However, the reality of being a knight in shining armor is far different than what is portrayed in films and books. In this video, we're going to tell you why you wouldn't last 24 hours in the life of a knight. From the insanely heavy armor to the filthy conditions and the life-threatening injuries. Keep watching to find out what makes being a knight so tough. First, the armor. When you think of a knight, it's likely that you imagine someone shiny and glimmering in their armor. Well, that's not really what it was like. Let's start with the basics. A full suit of plate armor could weigh over 50 pounds, which is more than double the average male's body weight. Now imagine trying to stand up with that weight pressing down on you. It would take an enormous amount of strength and endurance. And that's just to stand. Don't even get started on moving around in it. And forget about running or jumping. Those were definitely off the table. If you wanted to do anything remotely physical, you needed to be incredibly strong and trained for years to move in armor. Otherwise, you would likely end up falling over and probably injuring yourself in the process. Now let's talk about the helmet. This was the most important part of any knight's armor since it protected their head, obviously. But it also severely limited their vision. Some helmets had small slits for eyes, but others had much larger visors that would make it hard to see. Plus, how exactly do you see when you're breathing heavily? Not to mention the visor would steam up and then you'd have to stop and clean it off. In the meantime, your opponent could potentially run away or strike you. And don't forget the claustrophobia. Being enclosed in such a tight space can be terrifying for some people. The helmet muffled everything and made it difficult to communicate. If there was an emergency or you needed to give instructions to your comrades, it was difficult to do so while wearing a helmet. And then there was the smell. Knights wore the same armor for days or even weeks at a time, so you can imagine how bad it must have smelled after prolonged use. Plus, the armor absorbed sweat and other bodily fluids, making it sticky and gross. And let's not forget the itching. When you wear the same set of clothes for a long period of time, your skin gets used to them, and then you can't wait to take them off. But when you're wearing armor, you can't do that. So the itching drove knights insane sometimes. They couldn't scratch or adjust their armor without risking being seen and attacked by their enemies. Next, the training. We all know that knights were fierce fighters and warriors. However, what many people don't realize is that becoming a knight took years of training and conditioning. To become a knight, you would need to learn how to fight with heavy weapons, such as swords and shields, and participate in jousting competitions, as well as riding a horse. You'd need to be in top physical condition to handle the weight of the armor and weapons, and to endure the physical toll of battle. The training was intense and dangerous. Knights would often spar with each other and against other fighters, and the competition was fierce. Knights would do anything to win, including cheating or using dirty tactics. Speaking of training, let's look at how young knights got their start. If you were born into a noble family and wanted to be a knight, you would begin your training at a very young age. As a page, you would serve your lord and master, polishing armor, fetching weapons, and caring for horses. You would also receive basic instruction in fighting and horsemanship, At the age of 14, you would become a squire and continue to learn the skills necessary to be a knight. A squire's life was not an easy one. In addition to continuing to learn how to fight, you would also be responsible for cleaning armor, caring for horses, and cooking meals. You would also be responsible for carrying your knight's equipment into battle and assisting him in putting on his armor. You might think that this sounds like a lot of work, and it was. But it was also an important way to learn the skills necessary to be a knight. As a squire, you would spend long hours on your feet carrying heavy equipment and performing menial tasks. You would also be exposed to the dangers of war firsthand as you traveled with your knight. You would see firsthand the horrors of battle and the aftermath of war. It was a brutal and unforgiving world, but it was also an important part of the training that every knight had to endure. But let's say that you became a knight after all that training and preparation. Would you actually enjoy your new life? Well, that depends on you. A knight's life was not all it was cracked up to be. Sure, you might have been trained for years to be a fierce warrior, but that doesn't mean you would enjoy spending long periods away from home and not seeing your family and friends. You would also have to spend long periods of time alone with nothing to do but train and prepare for battle. That can get pretty boring. And don't forget the loneliness. You would be surrounded by fellow soldiers, but they would eventually leave and go back to their families. You would be left alone again. Being a knight was not an easy job. It took a certain type of person to be able to handle the pressure and responsibility that came with it. It wasn't just about being strong and skilled in battle, but also about being able to endure long periods of solitude and boredom. If you're not the type of person who can handle that, then being a knight might not be for you. The battlefield. Picture this. You're in the middle of a battle. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and death. The sound of clashing steel echoes around you as your fellow soldiers fall, victim to the enemy attack. You feel the sting of a blow to your shoulder, and a searing pain shoots through your body. Your armor is dented and heavy, and you can feel the blood soaking through your tunic. What would you do in this situation? Well, first, you'd need to stay calm. In the heat of the moment, it's important to keep your head clear and focus on the task at hand. You need to protect yourself and your fellow soldiers while inflicting as much damage on the enemy as possible. But it's not easy. The battlefield is a chaotic and dangerous place, and there is always the risk of injury or death. In fact, it was common for knights to be injured or killed in battle, and it was not uncommon for a knight to suffer multiple wounds in a single battle. And those wounds weren't just flesh wounds either. Knights were often hit with sharp metal swords and spears, which could pierce their armor and cause serious internal damage. So if you were a knight, you would need to be prepared for the worst. You would need to be able to fight bravely and effectively despite being injured, and you would need to be able to deal with the emotional toll of seeing your fellow soldiers die round you. The battlefield is a harsh and unforgiving place, and only the strongest and most resilient knights could survive it. It was a profession that came with great honor and responsibility, and it was not for the faint of heart. Injuries. As a knight, you would be constantly exposed to the elements, and you would often have to go without proper food and water. This would take a toll on your body and make you more susceptible to illness and injury. And then there were the injuries themselves. As a knight, you would be in close quarters with other soldiers and the enemy. This meant that you would be constantly exposed to blood and bodily fluids, which could easily become infected and lead to serious complications. Even a small cut or scrape could turn into a life-threatening wound if it became infected. And there were no antibiotics to treat infections, so if you got sick, you would be on your own. As if that wasn't enough, knights were often wounded in battle, and when you're in the middle of a fight, it can be difficult to tell how serious a wound is. A simple cut or bruise could be much worse than it appeared, and if you didn't seek treatment right away, it could lead to further complications. As a knight, it was important to be aware of the risks and take precautions to stay healthy. However, even the best efforts can sometimes be in vain. Injuries and illnesses were simply a part of life for a knight, and there was no escaping them. Amputations. The battlefield was a gruesome place, and there were times when it was necessary to amputate a limb. To save a knight's life, however, the process was not nearly as clean or precise as it is today. Amputations were performed with little to no anesthesia, and the process was excruciatingly painful. If you were unfortunate enough to have an arm or leg amputated, you would be in immense pain and suffering. The wound would be stitched up with crude materials, and you would be left to recover on your own. If you survived the amputation, you would likely be left with a stump that was sensitive and painful to the touch. This would make everyday tasks difficult, and you would likely require assistance from others to help you with basic functions. The psychological toll of losing a limb was also significant. For many knights, their limbs were a source of pride and identity. Losing a limb was not only physically painful, but emotionally and psychologically distressing as well. And now for the ultimate test. Can you last 24 hours in the life of a knight? Based on everything you've learned, would you still want to be a knight? If so, then good luck. But be warned, it's not an easy job. Most people would not be able to handle the physical, mental, and emotional toll that comes with it. The life of a knight is not all it's cracked up to be. It takes a certain kind of person to be able to endure the hardships and challenges that come with it. Are you that person? Only one way to find out. Try it for yourself. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to check out our other videos on medieval life.